I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you all for coming. My name's Hannah Hike, and I'm a senior in the Criminal Justice Undergraduate Program at CU Denver, as well as a member of Alpha Phi Sigma. In 2017, we started an event series that includes panel discussions, speaker events, and other forms of dialogue on issues related to criminology, criminal justice, and the law. I'd like to take a minute to thank the students, faculty, and staff in the School of Public Affairs for their support and extend a special thank you to the Dean of School of Public Affairs, Paul Teskey, for his help, to our events coordinator, Emma Martz, and to our marketing director, Tula Welbrook, for facilitating these events. Finally, I would like to acknowledge our Student Criminal Justice Honor Society, Alpha Phi Sigma, for their role in putting together these events. This evening's panel discussion focuses on drug enforcement, and we'll have two guest speakers. The first is Sergeant John Sherrill. He is in his 26th year with the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office and in his 12th year as a sergeant, where he is currently assigned to the Public Safety Bureau Patrol Section. Sergeant Sherrill has worked in the Detention Bureau as a deputy as well as a sergeant, Patrol Section as a deputy and a sergeant, and Investigation Section as a sergeant. He was also assigned to the South Metro Drug Task Force as an agent and sergeant, and was assigned to the Arapahoe County Narcotics Team as a sergeant. Altogether, he has about 10 years experience in narcotics enforcement and has worked with the DEA, ATF, HIS, IRS, USPIS, FBI, U.S. Marshals, Attorney General's Office, and other state and local narcotics enforcement teams. That is a lot of organizations that John has worked with. Our second presenter this evening is former Division Chief James Smith. He retired in 2010 after a 36-year career with the Boulder County Sheriff's Office. Throughout his career, Jim worked assignments including dispatcher, patrol deputy, detective, field supervisor, and watch commander. Collateral assignments included being a crisis negotiator, team leader, and SWAT commander. In 1998, at the sheriff's request, he helped form the Boulder County Drug Task Force, which he commanded for 5 years. The multi-jurisdictional unit was comprised of investigators from most of the police agencies with Boulder County and worked collaterally with federal agencies such as U.S. Customs and the DEA. So it sounds like we are in for a really exciting panel tonight. This event will last for approximately 1 hour, with the final 10 minutes reserved for audience questions. So without further delay, Sergeant John Sherrill will start when he's ready. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Hannah. So this is my first attempt at this Zoom training, if you will. I was going to go talk about like classifications of drugs, how we classify things versus the federal government here in Colorado, and then go over what the classifications are, what kind of drugs are typically found in each classification, and then some of the effects, and then go into some of the laws, and also some undercover stuff, some of the stories that I have, some cases that we worked, etc. So in the federal system, they classify drugs a little bit differently than they do here in the state. We do mirror it pretty closely, except for like marijuana, for example. But in Colorado, we have schedules 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which include the illicit drugs as well as prescription drugs. Marijuana in Colorado is its own statute, so it doesn't fall under any of the schedules. Currently, marijuana is a Schedule 1 controlled substance on the federal level, which I recently heard that they're trying to change that to Schedule 2. I'm not sure if that's accurate what they said, so they can do testing. That's why they need to move it down to a Schedule 2 controlled substance. But I think we've done a lot of testing on marijuana. Anyway, one of the new laws that came out March 1st of 2020 really put a hamper on how we do drug enforcement. So in 2020, the state legislators passed a law saying that possession of 4 grams or less of a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substance becomes a Class 1 misdemeanor. So a gram is equivalent to like 1 sugar packet. So heroin is a Schedule 1 controlled substance. So if you had 4 sugar packets worth of heroin, that is now a misdemeanor crime. And then all we do is write you a ticket for that. Possession of Schedule 4 controlled substance would become a Class 4 drug felony if a person is found to be in possession and has had 3 prior arrests. So if they're just arrests alone, not convictions, for a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substance, then that would become a felony. So when we arrest somebody for possession of heroin, we'd have to run their criminal history to see if they've been arrested. If it was their 4th arrest, then we could charge them with a felony. Any amount of GHB, ketamine, or cathinone is still a Class 4 drug felony. So some of the current trends that we're seeing, at least down in the metro area, methamphetamine still seems to be quite prevalent. We are seeing a large amount of it coming up from the south border. The price obviously is starting to go down because the supply is up. Heroin is also really big right now. And it seems that since Corona started last year, our overdoses has increased on the street level. And most of that is due to the heroin and fentanyl, or a mixture of both. MDMA or ecstasy and psilocybin mushrooms, we still have that, but not as prevalent as it was like back in probably the 90s or 2000s. A lot of those drugs, the ecstasy and MDMA, were more of like a rave type drug. When we had the club parties, we saw an increase of that in those kind of venues. Marijuana, obviously, when we legalized it for the medical benefit of it, and then later on as a recreational in 2012, that was supposed to decrease our workload, according to the people that were in the industry. But I personally was working narcotics during that time, and our workload increased, probably doubled the amount of work that we had to do to enforce marijuana laws. So the marijuana industry is, I'll get into that a little bit later, is, I can't stand the marijuana industry because of all the work that we had to put in for literally no punishment at all. So we spend hours and hours and hours, weeks and months doing these investigations. And at the end of the day, really all we get is probation out of these dealers. I'll go back to Schedule 1 controlled substance. So some of the drugs that fall into that category would be heroin, LSD, peyote, which I've never seen peyote. I've always tried to buy peyote. That was one of my goals, my bucket list. However, no one seemed to be able to get their hands on it. MDMA, GHB, ecstasy, and khat. I don't know if you ever heard of khat, K-H-A-T. It's a Schedule 1 controlled substance here in the United States. It was primarily found in our Ethiopian communities, where it's kind of like a methamphetamine. It's a plant leaves that they chew on that gives them that same euphoric high as methamphetamine would. Heroin, it's an opiate derived from the resin of poppy seeds. We see a lot more of the black tar heroin in the Denver metro area, which typically comes from the southern border. Like I said earlier, our heroin overdoses have increased tremendously especially this last year. There is brown powder heroin, China white heroin, I've only seen China white once, and apparently that stuff is pretty expensive. It's like $100 and some thousand a kilo. That's probably why we don't see it here. So I printed out some of my PowerPoints, so I'm just going to go through them. One of the things about when we classify drugs, or the government does, so the Schedule 1 controlled substance is deemed to not have any medical benefit and is a highly addictive chemical. Schedule 2, they said, does have some medical benefits, yet it's still highly addictive. So that's how they changed it. The difference between 1 and 2 is the medical benefit. So like cocaine, for example, is still used in like eye surgery. LSD was you guys bumped up to Schedule 1, but that was designed a long time ago as like a psychedelic drug to help with people that were suffering from mental health disabilities. Of course, mushrooms, psilocybin doesn't really have a medical benefit. Schedule 2 controlled substances would be like fentanyl, cocaine, morphine, oxycodone, methamphetamine. So those, you get those sometimes prescribed to you, like fentanyl or oxycodone or morphine. So that's the medical benefit of that. And some of the side effects related to like methamphetamine, for example, would be it's a stimulant that will cause you to be, I guess, lose your appetite, restless, nervousness, clenching of the teeth. So when we talk, at least on the street level, somebody has meth mouth, and their teeth are all broken up or brown in color. Used to say that was because of the chemicals used in methamphetamine, but really all it is poor hygiene. And for whatever reason, I'm sure James can concur, we find a lot of Mountain Dew in the search warrants or investigations that we do with methamphetamine or meth labs. A lot of Mountain Dew. Fentanyl is becoming very prevalent nowadays. We're starting to see morphine pills that are being pressed. So they're not commercially produced morphine pills, the M30, the oxycodone pills, the M30 pills. We're finding a lot of them, those pills, to have fentanyl in them. So somebody's got a pill press around and they're introducing fentanyl and then masking it as an actual prescription drug. Cocaine, some of the street names is like coke, yay, powder, blow, crack. The effects on with cocaine is obviously, heart rate increase, hyper awareness. And then the crack cocaine, I haven't really seen any crack cocaine for several years. That's just a smokable form of cocaine. They do a chemical reaction to make the powdered cocaine into a smokable form. So once again, I haven't seen a whole lot of crack cocaine over the years. Not like it was in the 80s and 90s. So the methamphetamine continues to be something that we see on a regular. We call it the speed, crank, ice, meth, crystal, tweak. We find that the amount of methamphetamine that's being brought up, it's everywhere. If you go over to a hotel or motel, you can bump into that stuff on a regular. And one thing about methamphetamine is that you could eat it, smoke it, you can inject it, and you can snort it. So you can do pretty much anything you want with methamphetamine. Back when I first got into narcotics in the early 2000s, there was quite a few what we call like mom and pop meth labs. So the chemicals that we could purchase at Home Depot or at the grocery store, they were using that in conjunction with some precursors like pseudoephedrine, iodine, and red phosphorus, which is basically the striker plates off of a like a road flare or matchbooks. Somebody came up with the idea that they can mix all that stuff with Coleman fuel and iodine and red phosphorus and do a chemical reaction and come up with a drug that will make you apparently clean your house a lot, take apart electronics, and go out and break into people's cars. With the meth labs, we're fortunate nowadays because of the legislation preventing you from being able to buy more than 2 boxes of pseudoephedrine a month. The iodine crystals, we can't even find those hardly. You used to be able to find those at like feed shops, and they used that for like horse hoof repair or cow hoof repair. So they took all that stuff off the market. They have a database now where they track people that buy Sudafed. So you can only, if you went to Walgreens and bought 1 pack and then went over to King Soopers and bought another pack and then went over to Target, they would know that you already bought your two packs of pseudoephedrine, so you can't buy any more. So that helped to curtail the number of meth labs that we saw. Certainly the higher quality and higher supply coming up from Mexico really put a damper on it. It wasn't even worth trying to make your own meth anymore. And the meth that they were making was pretty crappy meth anyway. So with meth labs, in order to make like an ounce of meth, you would have to have, I believe it's like, and James, you can correct me if I'm wrong, 640 30 milligram tablets of pseudoephedrine just to make an ounce of meth. Well, that ounce of meth that you tried to make will produce between 5 and 6 pounds of chemical waste that, no one really knew what to do with. The cooks would just throw it out in trash bags on the side of the roads or in community dumpsters, and potentially exposed, a lot of people to some serious hazardous materials. We have had some narcs over the years that work meth labs that have come down with cancer, and they attributed it back to working those meth labs, breaking them down and taking our samples and then separating the chemicals to have disposed of properly. There's another method that we found a lot in our eastern district out in the farmlands, Anhydrous Method or the Nazi method. They have these big tanks out there. I don't know if anybody is in the farming industry, but anhydrous means without water. And the idea behind that was like the farmers would impregnate their soil with anhydrous, and the anhydrous chemical would basically suck moisture out of the air and impregnate the soil. These guys figured out how to take that and throw some pseudoephedrine pills and some lithium batteries into a pot and then make meth out of that. And then some of the chemicals that they use, and I can't ever imagine injecting any of this stuff into my system, but acetone, red double I, starter fluid, sulfuric acid, denatured alcohol, antifreeze or heat antifreeze. We used to see a lot of these labs in, I would say, the majority of labs that I've done have been in trailer parks, but we found them in motels. I even did a meth lab in a $500,000 house in a basement where some adult kids were cooking meth in their parents' house. So it's not just like a poor man's drug, I guess. And then, of course, at the end of the day, when we go to clean up these meth labs, the taxpayers essentially foot the bill for a company to come out, separate the acids and the bases and all the trash, contaminated trash, which could be in the tune of, $10,000, $15,000 just to dispose of that. So needless to say, we spend a lot of resources and a lot of money in doing meth lab investigations, but I'm glad we don't come across very many anymore. So like Schedule 3 controlled substances are pretty much your prescription drugs. There are like steroids and ketamine that, is used for in veterinarian clinics. We saw a lot of that when we were having rave parties. For whatever reason, ketamine was a drug of choice if they didn't have any ecstasy. And then Schedule 4 and Schedule 5 are a lot of the like psychedelic drugs like alprazolam or Xanax, Klonopin, diazepam, Valium. And we see a lot of those prescription drugs mixed in with the illicit drugs. So you like Xanny bars and whatnot. But it's almost like when we do search warrants on like a meth house, or we were buying meth out of a house and do a search warrant, we almost always found prescription pills. It's almost like a pharmacy in these houses or apartments. On to marijuana. I don't have any current data on the number of marijuana shops and warehouses. I do have some information back in 2016 that in the Colorado perspective, there were 202 McDonald's in Colorado in 2016, 222 Starbucks coffee shops, and 424 recreational marijuana shops, and 516 medical marijuana dispensaries. So they outnumber almost 2.5 times McDonald's. So we know where our priorities were in Colorado. Like I said, marijuana is kind of like my soapbox, if you will. So we had legalized it, and I believe that the premise for a lot of the people, at least that I talked to, that they voted for the recreational was that they thought they were going to get this huge tax revenue that was going to pay for schools and parks and all this other stuff. But I don't really know of too many schools being built on tax money. I know at my sheriff's office, we don't use any marijuana tax money to fund any of our programs that we have. It's kind of like using a drug that we're going after to benefit, the legal side of things, or what I consider to be legal. Now, certainly there is some medical aspects to marijuana. I do know people that have been suffering from cancer, from chemotherapy treatments, where, some gummy bears that help them increase their appetite. Some people that had like glaucoma. Unfortunately, most of the people that we investigated on these illegal marijuana grows were people in their early 20s that said they had like a sports injury, yet there's a bunch of mountain bikes in the house. So it's like it's almost like a sham where they went and got a medical card from like the same, I don't know, 6 or 7 doctors in the metro area that gave them a prescription for medical marijuana. That gave them the right, if you will, to grow 99 plants and then possessed like 40 some ounces of marijuana. So you get a bunch of these kids living together, and next thing you know, we're investigating a house, like probably in your neighborhood, one of those kind of houses with 600 plants, and then several pounds of product. So the marijuana industry is actually pretty impressive as far as how they grow it nowadays with the clones. So this seed of the days of the 70s, when you had to like pick out the stems and seeds out of your baggie of weed, that was probably around 3 to 5% THC content, is now all cloned marijuana that can produce up to like 35-40% THC, just the flower itself or the bud. There is what they call, what's the word I'm looking for, where they basically do a, God darn, I forgot the word I'm trying to think of anyway, American marijuana concentrate. So they're stripping the THC off the plant material and putting it into, like butter or brownies or cookies, gummy bears, where they're getting like 75-80% THC concentrate in these candies essentially. And then, they make these candy bars with that high of THC level, and then they sell them. I got some here in the office actually. Looks like just like a Hershey bar, and they have like 10 little squares, but I don't know anybody that would eat a candy bar and just eat one square. So we get what we would call an overdose. I know a lot of people argue that you can't overdose on marijuana, but I can tell you that out on the streets recently, we had a guy running down the streets naked, breaking windows on cars, and it was indicative of like PCP. However, when we finally got the guy to calm down, he said that he had some edibles, some marijuana edibles. So that THC concentration and the amount that he ingested turned him into a temporary lunatic. So I know probably in Boulder County, the outdoor marijuana grows were probably a big problem for you guys. We did have a section of like Rampart Range where we were taking between 14 to 17,000 plants out of the national forest. And all those plants, like we never caught anybody, unfortunately, because, we had to get like helicoptered in to these areas. And there's evidence that there were illegals that had come up from Mexico to grow weed in our national forests. It was a lot easier to get the weed produced here than it is to get it across the border, especially the kind of weed people like nowadays, the fluffy buds, as opposed to the coffee can packed shape of a tire weed coming from Mexico or across the border. I can tell you that in my experience working these marijuana operations, it is one of I've never seen as much money, guns involved in any other drug than marijuana. Some of these houses that we'd hit would have millions of dollars just sitting inside the house because they can't get rid of it. They can't put the money in the banks. They can't buy cars and houses with cash. One of our big grows or big investigations happened to be from the Orient, people from the Orient, where they were trying to get their marijuana proceeds back to the home country. And they were trying to do it at like $80,000 at a time by strapping it to people and putting them on planes, go back to Vietnam. That didn't work out too well. Obviously we have techniques such as wiretaps or Title III wiretaps to intercept phone calls during our investigations that let us know that what's going to happen. And then we end up taking off these people at the airports. I was involved in a couple of cases where a lot of Colorado weed was being sent to Arkansas. We would follow, 300-400 pounds in a suburban clear across the country to Arkansas, and then hook up with the Arkansas DEA, and then they take over the investigation on their end. I ended up all over the country in Kansas City and the Twin Cities. We've been to St. Louis. Just our weed, for whatever reason, in Colorado was wanted all over the country. And the weed that we had here, if you bought it local, it'd be around 18 to 2,000 a pound. But you get that stuff all the way to the East Coast, it's worth $6,000. So, of course, that drives a lot of people. Anyway, so with the marijuana industry in the indoor marijuana grows, they're producing, turning these plants around like 4 to 5 times a year. So they're doing production constantly and supplying the rest of the states.
Hi there. Thanks, Hannah. I appreciate it. John, what strikes me with you talking, I retired in 2010. I stopped working managing the drug task force in 2003 after starting it in 98. Ran it for 5 years, and it strikes me how much has changed. Nothing really has changed. Much of what you're talking about is what we were dealing with when we started the unit. What I wanted to talk about a little bit is how these task forces are constructed, how they're funded, kind of how they operate. And again, this is from my experience in getting this unit off the ground. When we started the Boulder County Drug Task Force, what preceded that were 3 drug investigation units within Boulder County. City of Boulder had one, the Boulder Sheriff had one, and Longmont Police had one. And we would work together. However, what we found out is that while authorities have jurisdictions, oftentimes the criminals don't recognize those jurisdictions. So quite frequently, you're gonna, as John talked about, you're gonna have somebody maybe living in one jurisdiction and is dealing in several other jurisdictions. Our task force was created through Bureau of Justice assistance grants that were particularly earmarked to develop these multi-jurisdictional drug task forces. You put them together, and the reason behind that is you can share jurisdiction by sharing authority, and it allows you to share both resources and information, and you're not bound specifically by your own jurisdiction, working in your own jurisdiction. So you share resources, you share information. In our particular instance, we were local. Our unit was set up as a local unit. We were going to focus on local problems, and that was one of the selling points for it. When we got the grant, we were focused on a community policing model. Now, many task forces will start out with a focus to deal with a particular problem, street drug problem, hand-to-hand sales, much like you'd see in very urbanized areas like Denver and Aurora, that type of thing. Boulder had very little of that. We had some, but very little of that. Other task forces, maybe you'll focus on mid-level dealers, others high-level dealers. Our task force was really constructed to be a community policing model. We wanted to be in a position where somebody in one of the communities that we're serving can pick up the phone, say, there's a problem here. I think there's a guy that's dealing drugs down the street. We would put resources towards that, using all the same techniques that John talked about. And these are very traditional approach to narcotics enforcement. Requires undercover operatives, undercover work. It utilizes intelligence information. It utilizes surveillance and cooperation between entities. Our task force didn't have federal members, though we worked many cases with DEA and U.S. Customs. In fact, one of our best partners was U.S. Customs. which was kind of interesting. But we worked many cases with federal partners. But again, we had the ability to focus our efforts in our community from a community policing model. Boulder was a bit unique in terms of how we present it. At least that's what all the drug commanders when I was working would tell me. We were rather unique. It's an interesting demographic. It's affluent. There's 2 universities inside the city of Boulder that we would deal with. At the same time, we had a pretty strong migrant population in the eastern part of the county that were involved in the farming operations and truck farms and that type of stuff there. So they were fairly transient, fairly migrant. So we would really work the gamut. On any particular day, we'd be maybe working on the University Hill with students that were selling drugs there, and we'd be maybe working a meth operation out in Longmont. But we had very little of that urbanized hand-to-hand street dealing. Boulder had probably one of the biggest points of contention is when we started, and this predated the task force. The Boulder County Public Health maintained a needle exchange program. And what that meant is IV drug users could bring in used needles and trade them for clean needles. That was a decision the community made. It made sense from a health standpoint. They were trying to fight HIV/AIDS and hepatitis that are shared between IV drug users. And from a drug unit, we supported it. It was fine. If they wanted to do that, that was good, because I think it really focused on the public health aspect of trying to keep people as healthy and as sane as possible. But it didn't stop us from working traditional drug enforcement actions. Boulder had an interesting political climate. People wanted us to focus on hard drugs and not soft drugs. As John went through the classification system with drugs, I don't read hard and soft drugs out of that. But that was a question that, as a commander of the unit, I would get frequently. One of the biggest, and John touched on this a bit, one of the biggest impacts for us was when medical marijuana became law through a constitutional amendment in 2000. A lot of issues that we had to deal with in terms of how we're going to respond from an enforcement standpoint. Our federal partners really wanted us to ignore it, not deal with it. My problem at the time was that it was a constitutional amendment, and I'm sworn to uphold the Constitution of the state of Colorado. I needed to figure out a way how to maintain my support for defending the Constitution and reconciling that with some drug dealing that was going on. And in terms of the effort and the manpower that was put into these grows at the time, John's absolutely correct. It took more time to try to determine if a particular grow was a legal grow under the medical marijuana constitutional amendment than it took almost to process the prior grows that we had that were illegal. And at one point, we just didn't do it. And I think that's probably carried over with recreational marijuana, though that occurred even after I had retired. There are a couple of caveats when you run a multi-jurisdictional drug task force, from my perspective. My main priority was to maintain integrity. I needed to maintain integrity of the unit. I wanted to maintain the integrity of the agencies who supplied investigators to the unit, and I wanted to maintain the integrity of the detectives that worked it. The detectives I had were all very creative. They had plenty of ideas and suggestions on how to do their investigations. My job was to make sure that that stayed within the law and that we maintained integrity. there were a couple of other things that we ended up doing. One of my biggest fears, and John touched on this a little bit, the number of search warrants that you'll do in any drug unit far exceeds what probably any other investigator would do. And I would get people asking me about, I want to be a drug investigator. What do I want to do? Frankly, my first take was there are probably 101 other jobs in police work that may be more beneficial for you to do. But if you want a dynamic work environment and you want to write a lot of warrants and good at that, then come to the drug task force, because you're going to do that. We probably did. It wasn't unusual to do 3 or 4 search warrants in a week when we were really busy. They scared me, frankly. Search warrants scared the hell out of me. Mostly because of the unknowns. It's dangerous to serve them. It's dangerous for the people that you're serving warrants on. And what I had noticed in some of my experience and some of the training that I had gotten is search warrants sometimes are utilized to get enough evidence so you have a case that you can prosecute. There's a real motivation there to be able to get that warrant. Let me get the warrant to get enough drugs to have a better case. What we decided, we wanted to have a prosecutable case in hand before he conducted the search warrant. That way we knew it was a solid case. We could take it to the DA. We had DA was a partner in the task force. We had a specific DA assigned. So he would write off on all the search warrants and all the prosecutions that we had. But we wanted a prosecutable case before we did a search warrant. That way, if we came up dry on a search warrant, we still had a case. And it took away that motivation of the only way I can prove this thing is if I can get in and do a search warrant. The direction to our guys was build your case, do a little bit more work, do a little bit more investigation. Part and parcel to that search warrant was the fact that it's risky. It's risky to the officers. It's risky to the people involved. One of the things that scared me the most, and John touched on it a little bit, in some of these meth houses that we were doing, you'd go in and there would be kids in the house. So we did a lot of eyes on. We did a lot of eyes on surveillance. If there were kids in the house, wait till they're out. Just wait till they're gone before we do the search warrant. We would do a risk and threat assessment to determine whether our agents for the task force were going to serve the warrant or whether we're going to have a SWAT team serve the warrant. My SWAT team commander preferred to have SWAT serve them, but that's a lot of work for a collateral SWAT team to pull everybody out 2 or 3 times a week to serve one of our warrants. So we used our agents to do that. Now you got to imagine a lot of the guys working them look like undercover officers. So they're wearing gear like what John's wearing right now. We would make sure when we go in for a warrant that we were marked as law enforcement and do those warrants. If we could find a way to serve a search warrant rather than kicking in a door at 2 or 3 in the morning, which I think was very dangerous to everybody involved, we would try to do that. We would figure that out. Now, I know one of the things I had said is my perspective has changed since I've worked it and since I've kind of been away from the business of it. But it started to change a little bit when I was working the unit. I was the public face of the unit. I didn't do a lot of undercover work. I commanded the unit. So if a community group wanted to get information on the current drug trends, I would go there. I'd do a presentation, much like what it's like John's done hundreds of those. When you talk about the schedule of the drugs, what the trends are we seeing, and what our response to it is. One question I always got in these presentations was, what's the most dangerous drug you see? Fair question. We're working drug enforcement. My answer was always the same: alcohol. That came from my experience. I've seen more victims. I've seen more victimization. I've seen more violence wrapped up around the use and abuse of alcohol in my career than I ever have with the illegal drugs that we were investigating. That was one of my problems. The other problem, really, when I looked at it was, how do you measure success? Is it by the number of arrests that you make? Is it by the amount of asset forfeiture you generate? Those are quite frankly easy to generate. You can get a lot of arrests. Asset forfeitures kind of flow from that. However, as John would talk about, Colorado is put some restrictions on the use of asset forfeiture. I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing to have somebody else looking at it. What I liked about asset forfeiture is we used the criminals' money against them, because we'd use that to pay informants or purchase evidence in future investigations. That's typically where we'd put our asset forfeiture. Though when you look at the potential for corruption in the unit, and there's plenty of examples of how these units can and do go bad, oftentimes it's wrapped up around money. An example: you spend all week working on a case, you finally do a search warrant, you're doing overtime, you're not home for dinner, you know you're going to be there for another 3 or 4 hours. What does a good commander do? Call and order pizza. How do you pay for that pizza? Well, there's a temptation to take money off the table that is the criminal's money. You know you're going to get that through an asset forfeiture. Pay for the pizza with that. I was very concerned that may be the first step down a slippery slope, so I tended to watch that fairly carefully. And again, it brought me to the point of, is this the best way to do this work? It was drilled into me, and John touched on it. I mean, currently, which is kind of interesting to hear. Price and supply. You know you're being effective when the price goes up and the supply goes down. That was my federal funders. That's who would drill into me when you knew we were being effective. Never happened. Never happened once in my 5 years in it. I had plenty of dealers to deal with. I had plenty of cases to investigate. I never saw the price go up, and I never saw the supply go down. Frankly, the other thing, and I know we wanted to get to questions, so I'll just touch on this very basically. But since I retired, I've been trying to look at my career maybe through the lens of someone else. What could I do to make this career? You know, what can you do to make this profession better? How can you improve on that profession? I read a book. It's a tough book to read, but I'd recommend it. And it was written by Michelle Alexander, who is a civil rights attorney. Her husband's actually did a stint as a U.S. attorney. Interesting conversations around their dinner table, because he was prosecuting drug dealers, and Michelle's book is called The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And it talks about the history of drug enforcement from about the mid 80s on, and discusses some of the statistics that indicate that an overemphasis was placed on communities of color. And well, one of the examples, John touched on it, is the difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And this is federally. I think Colorado, in as John described it, their classification of illegal drugs is probably more in line with what we should be looking at. But at the federal level, the difference between possessing crack cocaine and powder cocaine was 100 to 1. In '86, under the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, it was mandatory 5-year maximum or minimum sentence for possession of 5 grams of crack. Those are 5 packets of sugar packets that John described. That was mandatory minimum 5-year sentence for possession. We're not talking about distribution, manufacturing, sale, which is probably what John, I know our unit focused mostly on, not possession, but it was the distribution, manufacture of drugs. 5 grams of crack, 500 grams of powder cocaine. That's over a pound of cocaine. That was mandatory minimum. What was so special about crack? Well, John described it. Crack was and you'll see it in meth as well, but it's a highly processed form of cocaine that allows you to smoke it. The quickest way to get high on any drug is to smoke it. The quickest vector is smoke through the brain. And that was a preferred use for it. But it also was in small quantities. It didn't cost a lot to buy. A dealer could carry a lot of it at any given time. And reportedly, the media reported that there was this whole aspect of dangerous and violent crime around crack versus powder cocaine. So 5 sugar packets of crack, pound of cocaine, you'd go to prison for the same amount of time. That wasn't changed until 2010 under the Fair Sentencing Act. And they did change it. They changed it to 18 to 1. So 28 grams of crack, which is about a little over an ounce of product, again, to a pound of powder cocaine. What Michelle argues in her book, and it's interesting to read, is the fact that crack was dealt in these urban areas, oftentimes in Black communities, made it easy to enforce. A lot of street drug crime stuff, it was very, very easy to enforce. So you had a lot of guys that were going to prison very quickly for possession of 5 grams of crack, but fewer that were going for possession for a pound of powdered cocaine, because it's tough to get a powdered cocaine. I don't know what the price is on a kilo of cocaine now, John. When we were dealing with it, we would spend 18 to 20 grand on a kilo of cocaine. I mean, those were big deals for us. Michelle also touches a little bit on the on how many of these folks go to prison and how they fill the prison. And I know we want some time for discussion, so I'll kind of cut it off at there. But what I'd say is I think it's important to look at how we do our job in public safety and public service, and how we can figure out better ways to do that. Is there a better way to do drug enforcement than pure law enforcement? I'm willing to go far enough to say that I think there is a role for law enforcement. Crudely put, maybe it's the hammer to get people more into treatment programs. But perhaps we could consider taking some of the money that we do for strict enforcement, looking at demand reduction, and more along those treatment programs that could maybe reduce the need for doing that. Task forces maybe should be set up to where you have a specific goal and you work your way out of work. That hasn't been done. I know the drug task force in Boulder is still operating. I know that they're doing good work, just like John is doing good work. I think it's benefit sometime to step back and take a look and see how we do it. I think at that we can maybe take some questions. I think that's pretty valuable.
Okay, thank you both. That was really interesting. I'm taking a class on drugs and society this semester, so it's fascinating to hear your guys' perspective. All right, so let's get into some questions. Since peyote is sometimes used in Native American rituals, how does one enforce this when it's a cultural practice?
Well, like I said, I always wanted to buy some. It was on my bucket list. I think it would fall in line with like an affirmative defense. So it's still illegal. However, it would be incumbent upon the defendant to present his case that this is for religious purposes. I don't know how the Bureau of Indian Affairs handles that. I'm sure that they probably deal with a lot more than we would here in the city. So I just say, I don't know if James agrees with that affirmative defense.
John, I think you're right. Boulder did address some of those issues. Probably what would happen, depending on the amount, and again, if you're looking for personal use or ceremonial use, I very much doubt our district attorney would have filed a case on that. Knowing that and knowing that that was a use, we probably wouldn't have made an arrest on it.
Okay. Do you think the legalization of psychedelic mushrooms in Colorado was a good decision, or do you think it will become a problem like the legalization of marijuana?
Well, it's a tough question. I think I haven't seen as much shrooms out there than I did back in the 2000s. I don't know if it was because it was illegal and people were selling it because, you know, you can't get your hands on it type of a thing. But I haven't seen shrooms in several years working the streets. I've been back on the streets for 3 years and I haven't seen a shroom one.
You know, I don't know. It's interesting when you say mushrooms. I think one of the county commissioners that I worked with in Boulder at the time that would tell me to work on soft drugs. I think he would probably consider mushrooms a soft drug because it was maybe organically grown. He considered marijuana as a soft drug. I don't know. I mean, I often would say when we were talking about legalizing marijuana, I would say, look at your model. Look at your model with alcohol. What happened? Alcohol, I think, is a more dangerous drug than both marijuana and probably mushrooms. We've accepted that. That's socially accepted drug. I think we're well on our way for marijuana to be socially acceptable. Are there problems with it as any drug? Sure, there is. But it was true back then. I think it's probably true now. Only about 10% of the population at any given time is utilizing any form of illicit drugs. We also know that use doesn't change across racial lines. It's pretty even across racial lines. Sometimes I think that I probably should have looked at the legalization of marijuana from the opposite position that I did. I said, look at alcohol, and that'll tell you the problems we're going to have down the line. I'm not working it. John is. From what I hear from friends, neighbors, and relatives, I don't see the problems that I anticipated with the legalization of marijuana. Maybe I should have looked at saying that's what we can expect out of legalization of marijuana and just what's happening with alcohol.
Great. Okay. Why did you decide to go into this line of work?
It's pretty easy. And to be completely honest and forthcoming, I wanted to be a wildlife biologist, and that was way too much science and math for me. So I asked a counselor what the easiest degree you could get, and he said criminal justice. So, but I was on a search and rescue team as a teenager, and I worked with the sheriff's office quite a bit. I became friends with cops as a teenager, and I had a next door neighbor that was a canine unit for Arapahoe County, and I just kind of grew up into it. I knew the sheriff, went to school with his kid, and I just kind of just morphed into that. You know, I didn't have any previous relatives that worked narcotics, but I was always that I wanted to serve my community. And since wildlife biology didn't pan out, here I am. It's been a great career, and Jim could say the same thing, man. It's every day is a different day. You never know what's going to happen. It's exciting to come to work every day. You know, supervising young folks nowadays, it's challenging, but it's rewarding in the same way because you can coach and mentor our younger guys that weren't even born when I started this career.
I love what John said in terms of what brought him into it, and only he and I on this panel can understand what I'm about to say. But I would tell virtually anybody that some people go into law enforcement, they have to be police officers. Other people go into law enforcement and they get to be sheriff's deputies. I like working for a sheriff's office. I think it is more directly accountable to the community that it serves, and I like that. I went into public safety because I wanted to help people. I wanted to make a difference. Maybe putting people, bad actors and folks that ran afoul of the law, putting them in jail was the benefit for doing that. But I like what John said. You wanted to improve the community. You want to serve your community and benefit that. In terms of narcotic enforcement, maybe I wasn't the best commander to make this drug unit go. I'd never worked. I'd been a detective. I'd never worked narcotics. I ended up supervising our drug enforcement unit as a part of our detective division. The sheriff asked me to write the grant and do the task force. I believed in the task force model. I think that's the way to do it. The story that I have, and John touched on it, about, well, it's jurisdictional about outdoor marijuana grows. When I talk about crooks don't maintain jurisdictions, but the authorities should, we had information on an outdoor marijuana grow. It's the most ingenious outdoor marijuana grow I saw in the mountains west of Lyons. We figured after looking at this that whoever was maintaining it was doing it just for the pure love of horticulture, because he wasn't ever going to make any money growing pot. And this is before legalization. He wasn't going to make any money growing pot where he was growing. It was way in the middle of nowhere. We set up surveillance cameras, remote surveillance cameras, because as John said, we want to get them. We want to find out who's doing that. When we downloaded the image to the camera, the only people we had were investigators from a neighboring drug unit in our county, outside of jurisdiction, but they evidently got the same intel information, anonymously reported is how we got it, as we got it. So I had fun with their chief when I said, listen, we have an outdoor marijuana grow. We think we know who's doing it. Here's a couple of pictures. And it was his drug unit that was involved in it. It's funny, but it's also a problem because it's a problem that we dealt with in real time. Say John is working his unit's working a cell operation. He's got a guy that wants to buy 50 pounds of marijuana, and by God, he's gonna arrest him. I'm working an operation, says, hey, I found a guy who's going to sell me 50 pounds of operation or 50 pounds of marijuana. And it's two units working against each other. I'm not sure, John, what the nature of the deconfliction unit is anymore. But when I was working, we had a number where you would call, hey, we're doing a search warrant at this case. We're doing a buy bust at this case. You know of anybody else that's doing that? Because you don't want to have these investigators going against each other. I never had the experience to work as a investigator like John had. I just had the responsibility to manage the unit from a supervisory standpoint. I think that was a benefit for me because I could step back and say, this is straight up police work. I know you're going to look like your undercover assignment is going to make you look like the baddest crook in history. That's a good thing, but I still am here to make sure that you maintain the integrity and we do straight up solid police work that we can get prosecutions on.
Well, thank you both. It looks like we are out of time, but I wanted to thank you both for joining us. It's been a wonderful experience to hear both of your perspectives, and I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Annie. Hey, good to see you, Jim. You take care. Enjoy that retired life.
I will. Jump in. The water's fine.
All right. Very good.